He has to get the air flowing over his wings by ignoring his own senses and trusting the instruments.
It's a mental battle because, yes, I am flying on that gauge, but man, I don't feel right.
He's regaining control, but the ground is coming up fast.
I've got to be very careful for how much I pull back on that stick.
The danger? He might stall again as he tries to pull up.
Okay, you started his recovery you can hear the buffeting now from the plane being loaded.
You can see how fast it is.
Now the aircraft's starting to G-load, starting to load up the G's. The airspeed's very high.
Damn.
Recover, Paul. That's a lot of altitude. And he's flying again.
Comtois finally recovers control, but despite years of jet fighter experience, the Air Force colonel lost 19,000 feet, more than half his altitude in just 45 seconds. Most airline pilots have no such experience, and autopilot means they do little hands-on flying. For Tony Cable, the case of Flight 447 highlights critical training issues.
It has raised the question about whether the situation is actually being made worse by the increase in automation, whereby crews don't get a great deal of opportunity to manually fly the aircraft.
Paul Comtois agrees.
The more we automate, the more we need to get back to the basics of flying. You know, when I'm flying that fighter to the edges, I am physically hands-on the stick and throttle.
Standard airline flight simulators don't have the freedom of movement to recreate extreme maneuvers.
Stalling is not something actually that's taught to transport category aeroplane pilots. We've gone from pilots who've had experience of some of the more extreme maneuvers to pilots who very rarely see them.
But the wreckage of Flight 447 suggests the pilots may have come close to saving their passengers' lives.
We know that based on the impact damage that the airplane was nose up pretty close to wings level with a high vertical sink rate when it hit the water.
Did they somehow manage to get upright and level before running out of time? Without further evidence, this is one question the investigators can't answer. A year after the accident, the search for Flight 447's black boxes continues. This is what the official investigation is looking for. But Flight 447's black boxes stopped transmitting location signals after 1 month. They're still lost in an underwater mountain range 2.5 miles deep.
The only way that we're going to find complete and total understanding of what happened to that airplane is if we're fortunate enough to get the cockpit voice recorder and digital flight data recorder.
If the black boxes are recovered, they're likely to prove there was no single cause for the accident.
In any of these accidents, they are chains of unusual circumstances. It only requires one of those links in that chain to be broken to prevent it happening again.
From the existing limited evidence, our independent team has linked together the possible chain of events. No single link is fatal in itself, but together, they provide the most convincing solution so far to the mystery of Flight 447. Just before 2:10 a.m., Flight 447 flew into a 250-mile-wide Atlantic storm. A possible reason? It was hidden from the aircraft's radar by a smaller storm.
We believe that the aircraft was probably in an area of turbulence which had been challenging to fly.
The next link in the chain. The storm clouds contained a rare form of water.
What's possibly unusual in this storm is to have supercooled liquid water this high up in the atmosphere.
Then, another unforeseen event. Flight 447's pitot tubes develop a problem.
There is little doubt that the airspeed systems failed in some fashion, probably due to icing, and that the aircraft went out of control from that point.
The automatic flight systems failed, forcing the pilots to take back control.
They were faced with multiple warnings, multiple system failures at night over water. Unbelievably challenging environment.
In similar previous incidents, pilots did not take control of the vital thrust levers as is standard procedure.
Crews can be very slow to get onto operating the throttles manually, which is very essential, of course, to maintain a decent airspeed.
If they lost too much airspeed, the potential high-altitude stall would have been far beyond most airline pilots' experience.
If you've never been there and you don't know what to expect, the results are going to be disastrous.
But in the final struggle, it's possible that the crew almost saved their passengers before a second, and this time terminal, stall.
They were not successful in surviving the event.
A compelling theory based firmly on the available evidence. But until the black boxes and their vital data are recovered, there can be no definitive proof. Aviation experts will continue to be troubled.
We do need to solve it. Aviation does not do well with unsolved mysteries. We need to understand what happened that night out over the Atlantic.